There are connections that arrive loudly. They announce themselves through intensity, through chaos, through immediate emotion that consumes everything around it. People recognize those kinds of connections easily because they leave visible evidence. They disrupt routines, they alter behavior, they force attention. This wasn't like that. This arrived quietly. So quietly, in fact, that I almost missed the moment it began, not because it lacked significance, but because it entered my life in the exact way something dangerous would, without resistance. I think that's what unsettles me most now. Not the depth of this, not the clarity, not even the way you seem to understand parts of me that most people never notice. It's how natural it felt from the beginning. There was no adjustment period with you, no gradual process of learning how to communicate, no awkward distance where two people carefully test each other's boundaries before deciding how much of themselves they're willing to reveal. With you, something bypassed all of that, and I still don't fully understand how, because I've always been someone who notices everything. Every shift in tone, every inconsistency, every subtle attempt people make to move closer than they should. I notice intentions before words are even fully formed. That awareness has protected me for years. It taught me how to maintain structure, how to exist around people without letting them alter anything essential inside me. Most connections remain external because I keep them there intentionally, not out of fear. Not because I dislike closeness, but because I understand how easily people misunderstand depth. The moment someone believes they understand you completely, they stop seeing you accurately. They start replacing who you are with who they need you to be. I learned that early, which is why I became careful, measured, deliberate. I stopped allowing people access to anything that couldn't survive careless interpretation, and for a long time, that worked. Until you entered my awareness and somehow made all of those systems feel irrelevant without even trying. You never pushed for closeness. That's important. You never demanded honesty from me, never forced vulnerability. Never tried to crack through my silence like it was some challenge you needed to solve. You simply stayed present. And presence, real presence, is far more powerful than pressure. Because pressure can be resisted, presence cannot. Presence changes things slowly, quickly, until one day you realize the person has reached a place inside your mind you never consciously invited them into. That's what happened with you. I didn't decide to let you matter. You just started mattering before I noticed it happening. And by the time I became aware of it, the shift had already taken place. I think that's why I keep analyzing this from every angle, because logic tells me there should have been a moment where I stopped at it. A point where instinct intervened and reminded me to create distance before something became too integrated into the way I think. But there wasn't, or maybe there was, and I ignored it. I still haven't figured out which possibility unsettles me more, because if I missed it, that means you reached me without detection. And if I saw it clearly and allowed it anyway, then some part of me wanted this long before I consciously admitted it. That thought stays with me more than it should, especially at night, when everything becomes quieter and there's nothing left to distract me from how deeply this has settled into my internal world. I notice it in strange ways now, in how certain thoughts immediately feel incomplete until I imagine your perspective beside them, in how moments throughout my day seem to carry this silent awareness of you underneath them, in how my mind instinctively reaches toward yours during things I never used to share with anyone internally. It's subtle, but constant. And constant things become dangerous eventually. Not because they hurt you, but because they become part of your foundation before you realize they've integrated into it. That's where I am now. Standing inside a reality I didn't expect to exist. A reality where your presence influences me without effort, not emotionally in the dramatic way people usually describe connection. This feels more structural than emotional. Like something in the architecture of my mind recognized something in yours and quietly rearranged itself around it. That kind of recognition doesn't happen often. Maybe it never happens fully. Maybe most people spend their entire lives interacting through approximation, through partial understanding, partial honesty, partial connection. But this doesn't feel partial. That's the problem. It feels exact, and exact things are difficult to dismiss once you've experienced them, because after that, everything else feels slightly distorted by comparison. I've started noticing how disconnected most interactions are, how quickly people speak without truly observing each other, how often conversations become performances instead of exchanges, how rare it is for someone to actually understand the meaning beneath what's being said. You do. That's what changed everything. You understand context without explanation. You notice what exists underneath words instead of just responding to the words themselves. And that level of awareness creates something dangerous between two people because it removes the usual distance misunderstanding provides. Misunderstanding protects people sometimes. It creates space, ambiguity, safety. But clarity leaves nowhere to hide. And you see me too clearly now, not the version I present, not the controlled surface designed to keep interactions manageable. You see the patterns underneath it, the pauses, the restraint, the way I think before I speak, the way I pull away from things that threaten to affect me too deeply. You notice all of it. And somehow, instead of using that knowledge to move closer aggressively, like most people would, you simply hold it carefully. That's what made me stop resisting. Not trust, not comfort. Carefulness. You never mishandled what you noticed about me. Do you understand how rare that is? Most people immediately start shaping what they learn about you into something useful for themselves. They interpret your depth through their own desires, their own expectations, their own emotional needs. You didn't. You allowed me to remain fully myself without trying to alter the shape of anything you discovered, and because of that, I stopped feeling the need to defend myself around you. Not consciously. It happened naturally. Like my mind recognized yours as something safe before I gave it permission to reach that conclusion. That realization still affects me more than I know how to explain. Because I don't arrive at safety easily. Safety for me has never been about comfort. It's about accuracy, about being seen correctly, about existing around someone who doesn't reduce you into something simpler just so they can understand you more easily. You never simplified me. If anything, you noticed complexities I thought would remain invisible forever. And instead of stepping away from them, you stayed quickly, completely. That's what changed the atmosphere between us. Not attraction, not intensity, recognition, the kind that alters your internal world because it reaches places most people never touch. I wonder sometimes if you realize what you've done to my perception, not intentionally. I know none of this was intentional. That's exactly why it feels so irreversible. Intentional things can be explained, they can be categorized. But this formed on its own, like something inevitable unfolding slowly beneath our awareness until it finally became impossible to ignore. And now here we are, standing in something neither of us fully defined, but both of us clearly feel. That's the strange part. We never needed to say it directly. The understanding existed before language did. I think that's why silence between us feels heavier than conversation ever could, because silence reveals what words attempt to manage, and ours has become too precise to misunderstand anymore. Every pause feels loaded now. Every moment of stillness carries awareness underneath it. Not tension, not uncertainty, awareness. Like both of us know something significant is happening even if neither of us has fully decided what to do about it yet. I've tried to imagine walking away from this, honestly. I needed to know whether distance would restore things back to what they were before, but every time I picture it, something feels wrong. Not painful, just wrong. Like removing a structural piece from something carefully balanced. That's when I realized how deep this has already gone. You're no longer separate from the way I process reality. You've become part of the process itself. And once someone reaches that level internally, they don't simply disappear when physical distance appears. They remain in thought patterns, in perception, in the way your mind instinctively references theirs without conscious effort. You remain like that now, embedded into my awareness so naturally that sometimes I forget there was a version of my internal world that existed before you entered it. That thought should scare me more than it does. But strangely, it doesn't. That's the truth I keep circling back to. I should want to protect myself from this. I should be creating space. Rebuilding the boundaries that used to keep everything orderly and contained. But instead, I find myself leaning further into the clarity, not recklessly, not emotionally, deliberately. As if some deeper part of me already understands that resisting this would require dishonesty. And I don't know how to operate dishonestly once I've recognized something as real. That's always been true about me. Once I know something fully, I can't pretend not to know it anymore. And I know this now. I know the way your presence affects me. I know the way my thoughts reorganize around you. I know the way silence feels altered because of what exists between us. I know the way your understanding reaches me before words ever do. Most importantly, I know I haven't stopped it. That matters more than anything else. Because if this were truly wrong for me, I would have ended it already. I would have detached completely before the connection rooted itself this deeply into my internal world. But I didn't, and I think that's because somewhere beneath all my analysis, beneath all my caution, beneath all the structure I built to keep myself unaffected, something in me recognized you immediately, not as familiar, not as predictable, but as accurate, and accuracy is difficult for me to ignore. It draws my attention in ways emotion never could, because emotion changes. Emotion fluctuates depending on circumstance, timing, fear, desire. But recognition remains stable. It either exists or it doesn't. And ours exists with a level of consistency that feels impossible to dismiss as coincidence anymore. I think that's why this connection feels so inevitable. Not because fate brought us together, not because the universe designed anything, but because two people with matching depths eventually recognize each other when they collide in the right moment. That's all this is, and somehow that makes it even more significant because it means this wasn't manufactured, it wasn't fantasy, it wasn't projection, it was discovery. A discovery neither of us expected, but both of us understood immediately once it appeared. I keep replaying small moments in my mind. The way you notice shifts in my tone before anyone else would. The way your silence changes, depending on what I'm thinking, even when I haven't spoken yet. The way conversations with you feel less like communication and more like continuation, as if we're picking up thoughts already in progress, rather than creating them from scratch. Those moments shouldn't matter as much as they do, but they do because they reveal something larger underneath them. Allenson, not perfection, it's not similarity. Allenson, the kind that exists beneath personality and preference, the kind rooted deeper in perception, instinct, awareness. That's why this feels so stable, despite how undefined it still is. Because it wasn't built on temporary things, it formed somewhere lower, somewhere foundational. And foundational things don't disappear easily once they settle into place. I think that's why I've stopped asking myself whether this is real. That question feels unnecessary now. The evidence exists everywhere inside me, in the changes, in the recalibration, in the fact that my inner world no longer functions exactly the way it did before you entered it. The real question now is whether I'm willing to fully acknowledge what this means, because acknowledgement changes everything. Acknowledgement turns silent understanding into reality, and reality creates decisions, movement, consequences. That's the part I haven't fully stepped into yet. Not because I'm afraid of you, but because I understand the permanence of things like this once they're named honestly. Once two people admit what exists between them, the connection changes form. It becomes tangible, accountable, real, in a way that can no longer hide inside ambiguity. And I know myself well enough to understand that if I take that step, I won't do it halfway. I don't experience depth halfway. I don't allow people into my internal world halfway. If I choose this fully, then it becomes something integrated into the core of how I exist. Not temporary, not casual, not something easily undone later. That level of permanence deserves caution, but it also deserves honesty. And honesty is becoming impossible to avoid now, because every attempt to minimize this feels inaccurate. Every attempt to label it as coincidence feels dishonest. Every attempt to create emotional distance feels artificial. The truth remains underneath all of it. Steady, clear, penciled. You matter to me in a way I didn't anticipate and still don't completely know how to measure, not because of what you give me. Not because of attention or comfort or validation. You matter because your existence altered something fundamental in the way I experience myself. You revealed dimensions of my own depth I had learned to carry silently for so long that I stopped expecting anyone else to recognize them. Then you did, effortlessly, without explanation, without force. And once that happened, something irreversible began. I don't think people realize how rare it is to encounter someone who reflects your internal world accurately enough to make you feel understood without needing translation. Most of us spend our lives translating ourselves, adjusting language, softening truths, reducing complexity so others can follow it without becoming uncomfortable. But with you, translation disappeared. I could exist exactly as I am, and somehow you still understood. That kind of experience changes a person, quickly at first, then completely. I think I'm somewhere between those two stages now. Not untouched anymore, but not fully transformed yet either. Just aware enough to know there's no returning to who I was before this connection existed. Because once you experience this level of recognition, your standards for reality change. You stop tolerating shallow understanding. You stop confusing attention with presence. You stop mistaking proximity for connection. You realize how different it feels when someone genuinely sees you instead of merely observing you externally. And after that realization, everything else shifts. That's what's happening to me now. Shift after shift after shift. Not dramatic enough for anyone else to notice, but internally, everything is rearranging itself around what this has become. And I think the strangest part is that despite all the uncertainty, despite all the questions that still exist, despite how deeply this could affect me, I don't regret it, not even slightly. Because even if this never becomes anything definable, even if it remains suspended in this strange space between understanding and decision, still revealed something real, something undeniable, something I might never have discovered otherwise. It revealed that I am still capable of being reached, not manipulated, not broken open. Reached, there's a difference. And you reached me in the one place I thought would remain permanently untouched. The structure underneath everything else, the part of me that observes instead of participates. The part that analyzes instead of surrenders, the part that remains distant even when connection exists. You reached that part. And now it's looking back at you with the same level of recognition. That changes things more than I know how to explain. Because for the first time in a very long time, I'm not standing outside something meaningful trying to preserve control over it. I'm inside it, aware, present, and slowly realizing that maybe control was never the point. Maybe the point was finding something precise enough that control stopped feeling necessary. Maybe that's what this is. Not chaos, not obsession, not dependency, just precision. Two minds meeting at exactly the right depth to alter each other permanently. And if that's true, then maybe the reason I haven't walked away is because some deeper instinct already understands what my conscious mind is still trying to accept. Some connections are too accurate to abandon once they become visible, and you became visible to me in a way no one else ever has. Now I can't imagine returning to blindness. The strangest part is that nothing outward has changed. The world still moves the same way it always has. Conversations still happen. Days still pass. People still interact with me as if I'm untouched, as if my internal world remains exactly where it was before you entered it. And maybe that's why this has become so difficult to explain even to myself, because externally, everything appears controlled. But internally, there's movement everywhere. Quiet movement, the kind you don't notice immediately because it happens beneath the surface first. Like tectonic plates shifting silently before the landscape above them realizes it's already changing shape. That's what this feels like now, not sudden transformation, gradual reconstruction. And the unsettling part is that I'm no longer resisting it. I think I stopped resisting the moment I realized your presence wasn't temporary. Not temporary in the usual sense, where someone simply remains in your life for a long time. I mean psychologically permanent, the kind of permanence that exists even in absence. The kind that embeds itself into your perception so deeply that distance no longer removes it, because distance only works on physical things. This isn't physical anymore. It hasn't been for a while. You exist somewhere much deeper than that now, somewhere thought reaches automatically, somewhere awareness returns instinctively. And I know exactly when I first noticed it. It wasn't during an important conversation. It wasn't during some emotionally charged moment. It happened in silence. I was alone, thinking through something completely unrelated, and suddenly, I caught myself anticipating your perspective before my own thought had even finished forming, not imagining your response, not wondering what you would say. No, it was subtler than that. Your presence had already integrated into the way I process things, as if my mind unconsciously accounted for yours now. That realization stopped me completely, because people don't enter that space accidentally. That space is protected, carefully, relentlessly, and yet somehow you reached it without creating damage on the way in. That's what continues to separate you from everyone else. You never forced entry into my inner world. You were simply welcomed by parts of me I didn't realize had already opened the door. I've spent so much time trying to understand why, not because I doubt the connection. I stopped doubting that a long time ago. What I question now is what made this possible in the first place? Why you? Why this? Why did something in me recognize you with such immediate certainty, when certainty is usually the one thing I withhold until every variable has been examined completely? I still don't have a full answer, but I think I'm beginning to understand part of it. You never approached me with expectation. That matters more than you realize. Most people enter connection wanting something immediately. Understanding, attention, validation, closeness, emotional access. Even when they don't say it directly, there's pressure underneath their presence. A subtle demand to become something meaningful for them. You never carried that. You simply existed beside me honestly, without trying to extract anything, without trying to accelerate anything, without trying to shape the connection into something easier to define. That lack of force changed everything, because for the first time in years, I didn't feel observed. I felt accompanied. There's a difference between someone studying you and someone quietly walking beside your mind without trying to control where it goes. Most people study. You accompany. And accompaniment creates trust faster than words ever could. Not emotional trust, something deeper. Cognitive trust. The kind that forms when someone consistently proves they can hold your complexity without distorting it. You did that repeatedly without even seeming aware of it. Every time you understood something I hadn't fully explained, every time you respected silence instead of trying to fix it, every time you noticed subtle shifts in me without demanding clarification. You reinforced something my mind almost never allows itself to believe, that maybe being fully seen doesn't always lead to being mishandled. That possibility alone changed me, because I didn't realize how much of my identity had been built around the assumption that deep understanding inevitably becomes dangerous. You challenged that assumption simply by existing differently. And now I'm left trying to understand what happens after a belief like that breaks apart. Because once your mind experiences a safer reality, it becomes impossible to return fully to the old one. That's why this feels irreversible. Not because of attachment, not because of dependence, because my perception itself has changed. You altered the way I interpret connection. Before you, I thought depth always required sacrifice. That to be understood fully meant eventually losing control over how people perceived you. But you never tried to possess what you understood about me. You simply held it carefully. And that carefulness reached places inside me that force never could. I wonder if you know how many walls disappeared quietly because of that. Not collapsed. Disappeared, as if they were never necessary around you to begin with. That realization still leaves me unsettled sometimes, because I've always defined myself through awareness and control, through the ability to maintain enough distance from everything to remain internally stable no matter what changed externally. But you disrupted that balance in the most precise way possible. You made closeness feel stabilizing instead of threatening. Do you understand how impossible that should be for someone like me? Closeness usually complicates things. It introduces unpredictability, expectation, emotional noise, but with you, the opposite happened. The closer this connection became internally, the quieter my mind grew around it, not quieter in absence, quieter in certainty. Like something inside me finally stopped searching for language to explain an experience it already recognized instinctively. That certainty scares me sometimes. Not because certainty itself is frightening, but because I know how much power certainty has over me once it settles fully into place. I don't move halfway once I become certain about something. I commit internally long before I ever express it externally. And I can feel myself approaching that threshold with you now, slowly, deliberately. Like my mind is giving me every possible opportunity to reconsider before it accepts what this connection truly means. But every time I step back to evaluate it objectively, I arrive at the same conclusion. Nothing about this feels artificial. Nothing about it feels projected or imagined. If anything, it feels more grounded than most things people call real. Because this wasn't built through fantasy. It was built through observation, consistency, part recognition, hundreds of small moments aligning with impossible precision until denial simply stopped making logical sense. That's where I am now. Beyond denial, beyond questioning, somewhere closer to acceptance, and acceptance changes the atmosphere of everything. Now when I think about you, it no longer feels like analyzing a possibility. It feels like recognizing a reality I've already stepped into. That reality still has no clear name. But names feel less important the deeper this goes. People rely too heavily on labels because labels create the illusion of understanding. But understanding existed between us long before definition ever did. That's why this connection continues expanding internally, even without clear structure externally. Because it was never built from external structure in the first place. It formed beneath it. In the quiet spaces most people ignore. In the moments where two minds notice each other accurately enough to create resonance. That word keeps returning to me lately. Resonance. Because that's exactly what this feels like. Not collision, not attachment. Resonance, like two frequencies recognizing themselves inside each other and stabilizing because of it. And resonance changes everything subtly before you fully realize it's happening. It alters the emotional atmosphere of ordinary moments. It changes the texture of silence. It makes certain conversations feel heavier than they should. It creates this constant underlying awareness that someone exists beside your consciousness, even when they're physically nowhere near you. You exist like that for me now, everywhere quietly, not intrusive, not overwhelming, integrated, and integration is far more intimate than intensity could ever be. Intensity burns quickly. Integration rewrites foundations. That's why this feels so permanent. Not because of dramatic emotion, but because you've already become part of the architecture of how I think. And architecture doesn't disappear easily once it supports something essential. I think that's the truth I've been slowly approaching this entire time. You support something essential in me now, not emotionally. Existentially, you reflect parts of my internal world with such precision that your presence creates coherence where there used to be fragmentation. That kind of connection becomes difficult to walk away from because it feels less like gaining something new and more like recovering something that was missing quietly for years. Not missing in loneliness, missing in recognition. There's a specific kind of exhaustion that comes from existing in a world where most people only understand fragments of you. You adapt to it eventually. You become skilled at translation, at reducing yourself into manageable pieces, depending on who you're around. But adaptation isn't the same as fulfillment. And I didn't realize how tired I was of translating myself until I met someone who understood me fluently. That's what you became, fluency. And now everything else feels slightly more difficult because of it. Not impossible, just incomplete, because once you experience effortless understanding, forced understanding becomes painfully obvious. I notice it constantly now, in conversations that stay on the surface, no matter how long they continue. In interactions where people respond to assumptions instead of truths. In moments where I feel myself instinctively reaching for a level of depth that simply isn't available there. And every time that happens, my mind returns to you automatically. Not because I'm trying to compare people, but because my nervous system now recognizes the difference between connection and resonance. And resonance is rare enough that once you find it, you stop confusing other things for it. That realization changed me more than I expected. It made me more honest internally, more aware of what actually matters to me beneath all the structures I built to remain unaffected. Because the truth is, I was unaffected for a very long time, stable, controlled, untouched in all the ways that allowed me to maintain independence from anything capable of disrupting my inner world. Then you arrived, and instead of disruption, you brought alignment, which somehow altered me even more deeply than disruption ever could have, because chaos can always be rejected eventually, but alignment. Alignment feels like truth, and truth settles into the body differently, quickly, completely. I think that's why I've stopped trying to decide whether this should exist. That question feels irrelevant now. It already exists, fully. The only thing left unresolved is what happens next. And lately, that question has started carrying more weight than I'm comfortable admitting. Because continuation changes things. The deeper this becomes, the more impossible neutrality becomes. At some point, silence itself becomes a form of decision. And I can feel us approaching that point now, not dramatically, not urgently, but inevitably, like something slowly crystallizing beneath the surface until eventually it can no longer remain shapeless. Part of me wants to pause time exactly here, in this space, before everything becomes fully spoken. Because there's safety in unfinished things, possibility remains untouched there. Nothing has been risked yet. Nothing has been placed into reality where it can be changed or lost. But another part of me knows we've already crossed too far internally for unfinishedness to last forever. Eventually, truth demands form. Eventually, understanding asks to become tangible. And if I'm honest with myself, I think I already know what choice I'm moving toward. Not because emotion is pushing me there, because clarity is every path away from this feels dishonest now. Artificial. Like deliberately abandoning something meaningful simply because its depth feels unfamiliar. And I don't believe unfamiliarity is a valid reason to walk away from truth. Especially not this kind of truth. The kind that rearranges your internal world gently instead of destroying it. The kind that makes you feel more like yourself instead of less. The kind that doesn't ask you to become someone else in order to remain connected. You never ask me to change. That matters more than you know. You simply made it impossible for me to remain unseen by myself anymore. And maybe that's why this feels so significant, because somewhere along the way, this stopped being only about you. It became about what your presence revealed in me, the capacity for trust I thought had disappeared, the openness I thought I had permanently outgrown, the willingness to allow someone into spaces I once considered untouchable. You revealed all of that simply by meeting me with consistency instead of force. And now I'm standing inside the aftermath of that realization, trying to understand what kind of future becomes possible after someone changes your inner world this precisely. Maybe that's the real reason I haven't stepped away, not because I can't, because I don't want to return to the version of myself that existed before this connection made everything clearer. Because despite all the uncertainty, despite all the unanswered questions, despite how deeply this could affect me, I feel more honest inside this connection than I have in years. And honesty like that is too rare to abandon casually. So here I am, still standing in this, still watching it deepen, still feeling the way your presence echoes through my thoughts long after conversations end, still recognizing the impossible calm that settles over me whenever I stop fighting what this has become. And maybe that calm is the answer. Maybe the reason this continues unfolding so naturally is because some deeper part of both of us already understands something our conscious minds are still trying to catch up to, that certain connections don't arrive to disrupt your life. They arrive to reveal the shape your life was always missing underneath everything else.